Okay, so I need to confess something. I have never actually read The Lord of the Rings. I know that must seem like blasphemy as a fantasy fan, but hear me out. Around the same time my dad was reading me Sabriel, he also read The Hobbit to me, and I quite liked it. So much so, in fact, that after the first Peter Jackson movie came out, I decided to read The Lord of the Rings as well. I ended up giving up because I found the whole thing boring and then just never got around to revisiting it. Once I decided to become a writer, and more specifically a fantasy writer, though, I avoided Tolkien for a different reason. J.R.R. Tolkien is, for all intents and purposes, the father of the fantasy genre. There are, of course, predecessors to him, but when most fantasy writers look for inspiration, they look to Tolkien, either as an ideal to parrot or a bane to mock. Neither of those situations appealed to me. I didn't want to write my take on Tolkien, I wanted to write my own stories, so I deliberately avoided him for many years. But now I finally have published my first fantasy novel, and the rest of the story is written and ready to send to the printers, if I can just manage to sell those 200 copies. So I think I'm comfortable enough in my narrative voice and vision that even if I do read Tolkien, I won't obsess over him in the same way authors like Christopher Paolini or Michael Moorcock do. As such, I am now going to revisit The Hobbit and restart The Lord of the Rings, to look on them with fresh eyes and see how I like them. To start, of course, I begin with The Hobbit. What is The Hobbit? Well, it's the story of the titular protagonist, Bilbo Baggins, and his adventure across the land of Middle-earth. Bilbo is living a peaceful life in his home of Hobbiton, when one day an old acquaintance, Gandalf the Wizard, ropes Bilbo into aiding a company of 13 dwarves in their quest to reclaim their homeland in the Lonely Mountain. Centuries ago, the Lonely Mountain was taken over by a dragon named Smaug, and now the dwarves seek to slay the beast and take back what is theirs. Bilbo is reluctant to join the adventure at first, but once committed, he is thrust into a journey far more wonderful and perilous than he could have imagined. How does the world of The Hobbit work? Okay, this is one of those works where I'm not quite sure how much effort is even necessary on my end when answering this question. Tolkien's stories aren't simply famous, they're ubiquitous. Even if you've never read one of his books, you have at least a basic understanding of what the world of Middle-earth is like. So I think instead of detailing names of characters and places, I will focus more on broad narrative strokes employed by Tolkien in handling this story, as well as things which surprised me or defied my expectations. The Hobbit was initially conceived as a story for Tolkien to read nightly to his children, and upon revisiting it, I can see why my own father chose to read it to me. Every chapter involves a self-contained narrative vignette with increasingly more dangerous foes and perils, and even after Smaug is slain, the story keeps going for as long as Tolkien can manage it. It's all weirdly reminiscent of a shonen manga series, which might in part explain all that fan art that popped up in Zero-chan back when the first movie came out. Similar to revisiting Sabriel, I found myself oftentimes going, oh yeah, as I remembered a passage or event which I'd forgotten. It was really wonderful to remind myself of why I loved this book as a kid. Something which didn't sit as well with me, though, is of course the book's handling of race. If you've seen my video on Record of Lodoss War, or even simply heard me talk about race in fantasy, you know that I don't enjoy the flippant manner in which race often gets treated in the genre, since it's typically a lazy, essentialist manner of world-building which has unfortunate parallels with some of the darker propaganda campaigns of our world. In The Hobbit, though, I was pleasantly surprised by how Tolkien handled his fictional world's races. It's not ideal. Certain races are still presented as having intrinsic qualities and predilections, with some races like goblins being naturally barbaric and vicious, but given how the story is evocative of Old Norse sagas, which makes sense given Tolkien's passion for them, the enmity between the dwarves and goblins isn't presented so much as a clear-cut good versus evil situation, but more a general bitter feud that dates back for so long, everyone's forgotten why it even started in the first place. We still never meet any goblins who aren't evil monsters, but this is a more nuanced portrayal than something you'd get from a standard Tolkien clone. Another big surprise to me was the Arkenstone and the dwarf leader Thorin Oakenshield's character arc with it. This may be shameful to admit, but when I watched the Battle of Five Armies movie, I assumed that whole subplot had been invented whole cloth. In fact, though, it's part of the original book, and plays a major part in the conflict after Smaug's death. I gotta admit something else shameful, though, guys. I gotta complain I read an abridged version of The Hobbit. I know, I didn't realize it was abridged when I got it because it had all the chapters and it all seemed fine, but then they just completely cut out the Battle of Five Armies. I mean, Bilbo gets knocked out, and then they cut straight to the aftermath. So, I'm sorry for missing out on that whole section of the book. I'm sure in the original it was much cooler and more epic, but I don't think it detracts too much from the story, or overly affects the answer to the question, what does The Hobbit have to say? Not a massive amount, because, again, it's designed as a children's story. It's mostly just about Bilbo going on an adventure, but even so, there is one pretty big message that gets told through Thorin and his relationship to the Arkenstone. Thorin and the other dwarves start out wanting to reclaim the Lonely Mountain from Smaug because it's their homeland, and they feel that they have a right to take it back. However, once they actually succeed in this, Thorin becomes obsessed with hoarding all the treasure he can, just like Smaug before him. Even though the dragon is slain, this hasn't solved things, so much as generated a new set of problems. And then when elves and goblins and men come to also stake a claim to the gold, things continue to escalate. Thorin is eventually killed in battle against these forces, but even with him gone, the conflict isn't going to die anytime soon. People will continue to squabble and fight over the Lonely Mountain's treasure, and with his dying breath, Thorin woefully remarks, "If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world." It's a good message, I think, and illustrates an important difference between Tolkien and his more reactionary fans. Rather than wanting to recreate a time that never really was, Tolkien through The Hobbit expresses a desire to maintain ideals which he thinks are still of value in an increasingly changing world. It's not so much about wanting to undo change as it is to ensure the change doesn't destroy something important in its march forward. I don't know if this message or my reading will change when I embark on The Lord of the Rings, but for now, I think The Hobbit is worthy of all the praise it receives. Final verdict. Okay, so another thing I'm going to do with this Tolkien series of videos is have a woman count! Tolkien's books are all huge sausage fests, as you know, so I'm going to keep a count of how many named femoids we run into with each book. With The Hobbit, the count stands at 1, with Bilbo's mother, Belladonna Took. Mind you, we don't actually interact with her, but we do hear about her, so I figure I'll count her this time. But just this time. All the others, our heroes will have to actually interact with a woman for her to make it to the count. Concerning the book itself, as with Sabriel, I found reading The Hobbit to be a wonderful stroll down memory lane. I don't know if I still have the Rankin Bass record that I was never able to listen to as a child. I mean, come on, you think I had a record player growing up? But I was reminded of when I would look at the record cover every night before hearing a new chapter, just so that I wouldn't forget what the characters looked like. The Hobbit is an interesting book because it's essentially an adult trying to boil down his scholarly interests into a format which his kids will enjoy. Andrew Wiles gave up on such a venture, but the sheer fact that Tolkien even attempted warrants admiration in my mind. And in the end, I think the finished product warrants a good, solid 8 out of 10. The story is well plotted and thought out, Bilbo is an enjoyable and realized protagonist, and the message is one I think will stand the test of time. In the meantime, I'm Marco Keane, signing off, and I hope you liked this video. If you did and you'd like to see me make more, please leave a like or comment down below, share my video via Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or other means, and subscribe to my channel. Also, on the subject of that book of mine, like I said, I need to sell 200 copies of The Song of Morian Mercia Monsters to be allowed to publish the rest of the story. So if you go on over to Amazon and purchase it for just $1, you'll not only be helping me, but you'll be getting a great book in the bargain. Thank you all, and I will see you in the next one.